So from Riot to Revolution, Rethinking the American Foundation. Every country has mythologized histories. It's an important part of civic nationalism, national identity, and explaining how countries and governments come into being. But the founding myth has been particularly strong in the United States. So what is the American founding myth? So traditionally the story of the American Revolution is of 13 British colonies fighting against the tyrannical oppression of the British government and King George III. It's a story of a people whose affinity to Britain was tenuous at best, and in 1789, David Ramsay, one of the first historians of the American Revolution, wrote that in colonial America, quote, the affection for the mother country and attachment to their sovereign, as far as it was a natural position, wore away in each subsequent generation until at last it had scarcely any existence. The Stamp Act riots are traditionally seen as the beginning of the American Revolutionary period. In 1765 and 1766, American colonists denounced Parliament's authority to levy inland taxes over them, burned effigies, staged violent and destructive riots, and the cries of no taxation without representation are seen as culminating in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence and the birth of the new republic. So that's the American story. Now, in reality, the American colonies were only 13 or what became the U.S. was only 13 colonies out of 26 colonies and provinces that made up British America. The American Revolution, in fact, has important implications for the colonies that become modern-day Canada, the West Indies, and the U.S. founding myth has actually been reinforced by Canadian narratives which emphasize loyalty to crown and empire. Throughout the Revolutionary War, colonists who opposed independence joined regiments to fight the Patriot rebels. These loyalists are often characterized as wealthy elites, recent arrivals to America, and they certainly included these people, but many were the descendants of the first settlers. They were the educated, the illiterate, white, and black. At the war's end, nearly 75,000 loyalists left the U.S. for the West Indies and the colonies that have become Canada. And that's actually what this painting is depicting. It's Britannia welcoming her loyal sons and daughters back to the empire, sort of fleeing the American Republic. And the arrival of the loyalists in Canada has reinforced an identity defined in opposition to the U.S., one based on loyalty to Britain. And John McMullen, in his 1868 History of Canada, published just after Canadian Confederation, wrote that at the time of the Stamp Act crisis, quote, although America was already heaving in the throes of revolution, the people of Canada remained peaceable and tolerably contented. So the Canadian story goes. So again, as reality would be, in 1765, due to mounting debt from the 7 Years' War, Parliament passed the American Stamp Act, putting a tax on paper goods in the American colonies and requiring stamps like these on pretty much everything. Now, although Parliament had passed legislation concerning the colonies for over a century, most of that legislation had been trade regulations. And this was the first inland tax levied by Parliament, which raised issues of the right to be taxed only by consent. And additionally, the Stamp Act denied trial by jury for people accused of violating revenue and trade regulations that was passed by Parliament. The Stamp Act affected all of British America, so it's the 13, as well as Nova Scotia, Quebec, and all of the British West Indies. The Stamp Act led to widespread protests in the colonies that became the U.S., as well as those that didn't. The entire newspaper industry was affected by the Stamp Act. Every issue had to be printed on official paper. Now, many published notices announcing that in protest they would cease printing, and a striking example being the Pennsylvania Journal's announcement of its own death, this sort of grave-like design. And many of the papers, which continued to print illegally, would print their own versions of the stamps, most often skull and crossbones, which I think is quite funny. But the 13 weren't alone in doing this. So in Nova Scotia, the Halifax Gazette, which is the only paper printed in that colony, was printed on stamped paper, but the printer offered to deface them, and what he did here is he's printed the paper upside down, so the stamp was upside down, and then put on a woodcut of a devil jabbing at it with a pitchfork. So he clearly wasn't too thrilled about the Stamp Act. So resistance to the Stamp Act was violent, and in Boston, rioters hung effigies of the stamp distributor from the Liberty Tree and demanded his resignation and the effective nullification of the act. One observer wrote to his brother that the effigies were brought by the mob to the main street to the supposed stamp office near Oliver's Dock, and in less than half an hour laid it even with the ground. Not contented with this, they fell upon the sandmaster's dwelling house, broke glass casements and all, also broke open the doors, entered the house, and spoiled a good part of the furniture. In addition, Bostonians also destroyed the lieutenant governor's mansion, and similar riots soon broke out in the other colonies. Historians have most often ignored the effects of the Stamp Act in Canada, but in October 1765, Nova Scotians hung an effigy of their stamp distributor on the gallows in the Citadel in Halifax. By December, Nova Scotia's stamp officer had hired 15 soldiers to guard his house and his person in response to threats. In the British West Indies, the colonists of the Leeward Islands responded with the same intensity, ransacking the homes of their distributor, his deputy, confiscating the stamps, and publicly burning them. U.S. historiography also tends to view the Stamp Act riots as unprecedented, uniquely American, and marking a distinctive break in colonial history. The colonial response, as it turns out, was not unusual for the 1760s. In the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, Great Britain was in a financial crisis, and in the post-war period was marked by rioting and upheaval. A month before the first American Stamp Act riot, the silk weavers of London marched on the Houses of Parliament protesting a trade agreement to import French cloth, after which they then ransacked the home of the Duke of Bedford. And in 1763, 2 years before the American Stamp Act, Parliament raised an excise tax on cider, which granted excisemen the authority to enter and search private homes unauthorized by a warrant, and denied jury trials to those accused of violations. The cider excise was seen as an affront to Magna Carta, the traditional rights of freeborn Englishmen, and spurred significant outcry in London and the West Country. Protesters in the West Country and throughout Britain hung effigies of tax officials, the Prime Minister, in these elaborate public processions. They pelted excisemen with stones to coerce their resignations, they smashed windows, and even attacked MPs who backed the bill. The colliers in Gloucestershire formed a loose vigilante group, the Sons of Darkness, and threatened to take all the excisemen that came within their reach to the regions below until the Cider Act was repealed. Now, the similarities between the West Country and the colonial riots are not accidental. After the first Stamp Act riot, the Boston Gazette wrote that, quote, "The whole continent is in despair, having been threatened with the loss of liberty dear to them than their very lives, and the people very exactly copied the example set them by their brethren at home." Americans saw the Stamp Act as a continuation of the denial of rights under the Cider Act. Colonists adopted the slogan of the cider protest, "Liberty, property, no excise," which you can see in a banner in the back of this engraving. Americans shouted at the first riots and subsequently utilized it in print. The stamp duties and the cider excise, although both taxes, a stamp duty was not an excise. So their usage of this phrase is quite important and shows that it was a conscious effort by Americans to link themselves to the ongoing protests in the West Country. This poem, titled "Liberty, Property, No Excise," celebrated the first Stamp Act riot in Boston, and its text sort of gives its hope for a resolution which would preserve the rights and liberties of all Englishmen and gain Americans' favor in their monarch's eye. In the corner, there's this interesting woodcut of a jackboot with devil's horns, which is both a reference to the boot hung in the Liberty Tree in Boston, but it, together with the title, links the Boston riots to the protest against the cider tax. They were often hung boots, and actually in the other image, I can't go back. Yeah, there it is. You can see the burning boot. So the colonists later modified the slogan to "Liberty, Property, No Stamps" to more aptly fit their circumstances. In December 1765, the Boston Evening Post added the tag, "The united voice of all His Majesty's free and loyal subjects in America, liberty and property and no stamps," on the front page of all of their editions, a move which was very quickly adopted by other publications. The Stamp Act promoted colonists throughout British America to articulate constitutional arguments defending what they believed to be their rights as Englishmen, and led to violent public demonstrations. Englishmen on both sides of the Atlantic were fiercely protective of their rights, and actually very little about the American protests against the Stamp Act was really revolutionary. The Sons of Liberty, the Sons of Liberty, which were instrumental in orchestrating many of the American demonstrations and riots, thought of themselves actually as defending the British Constitution. In this letter to the Sons of Liberty of Boston, the Sons of Liberty of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, both in what was supposed to be very radicalized New England, agreed to coordinate with other organizations only because they had, quote, "fully declared their unshaken loyalty to our rightful sovereign King George III, and their resolution to maintain and support his crown, their respectful submission to his government according to the known and just principles of the British Constitution." In 1765, Americans saw nothing contradictory in rioting against the Stamp Act and simultaneously proclaiming loyalty to George III and the British Empire. Rather than the start of a break with the mother country, the colonial resistance should be viewed as part of a trend within the greater 18th century British Atlantic. Americans saw the Stamp Act as part of a broader problem, a conspiracy led by corrupt ministers against the liberties and freedoms of all Britons throughout the empire, not just in America and not just in the 13. The colonial reaction in 1765 and 1766 was an assertion of British identity and not a rejection of it. And that's a very short talk. That's all I have.